As promised, let's talk a bit about the origins of mortuary rituals for humans. Anthropologists are not as concerned with the dead themselves, but with the people who bury them, because the dead do not bury themselves, but are treated and disposed of by the living. Bioarchaeologists, therefore, seek not only to document ancient rituals by recovering the evidence of past funerary practices, but they also attempt to understand them within their historical contexts and to explain why they were enacted in the ways that they were. One of the main ways in which we interpret past societies is through recovering the material traces of those practices associated with the remains of the dead. These practices not only reveal the relationships between mourners and the deceased, but can inform us about their philosophical or religious beliefs, social identities, and any socio-political or ideological changes. It's important to ask, though, mortuary rituals for whom? And actually, anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, are not the only species to have mortuary rituals. We've observed such behaviors amongst wolves, elephants, dolphins, otters, geese, and sea lions, who also grieve. Gorillas and chimpanzees show evidence of mourning and say goodbye to their lost family members. In the additional materials for this week, I'm going to include a newspaper article, actually, talking about a particular example in a zoo in Chicago where some chimpanzees had a type of mortuary ritual. What's also the case then is we now have newer and more evidence for Neanderthals actually having practiced mortuary rituals as early as 60,000 years ago. So this begs the question then, when did human ancestors begin to bury their dead? For some archaeologists, we now see evidence that there are Neanderthal burials going back 60,000 years, and we'll look at two of these burial sites in particular to examine the evidence. First, though, Neanderthals are recognized as one of our ancient ancestors. They're in the family of hominids. These are species that inhabited Europe and Western Eurasia about 127 to 30,000 years ago. They are characterized by large, robust features. So you can see the very prominent brow bridge on the skull that you see here on the left. They did make tools and hunted large game animals. Their sites are typically found in caves or rock shelters, so these are occupational areas that tend to be characterized by concentrations of tools, evidence of tool making, as well as animal remains. So the first site we want to look at is SHANIDAR Cave in Iraq. This is an archaeological site discovered in the 1950s, where scientists have unearthed the bones of 10 Neanderthal individuals thought to have died about 70,000 years ago, and to have been deliberately buried. Which begs the question, was the cave a burial site? So the original excavations challenged the ideas of Neanderthals as these primitive, brutish subhumans. Some archaeologists have argued that at least some of the Neanderthals we see buried here, were partially buried. One of the individuals showed signs of disabling injuries, suggesting that others would have had to have cared for him while he was still alive, so showing healing on the bones or injuries themselves. The site is controversial, but researchers are now think there's compelling evidence that SHANIDAR Cave was used to inter the dead. Some bones that have been found were articulated, suggesting that the bodies were not left in the open where scavengers could get to them. One such body was labeled SHANIDAR 4, and it's been interpreted as a purposefully constructed burial that was surrounded by flowers. That's because researchers found clumps of pollen around this burial, leading to the speculation that it had been adorned with flowers and is now called the flower burial. The flower types that were found may have actually been chosen for their medicinal properties, which is quite interesting. The species are associated with diuretics, stimulants, astringents, and also anti-inflammatories. The individual themselves was an adult male, aged 30 to 45. in a flexed position on their left side, so kind of in a fetal position. And if you can see my mouse, I don't know if it'll come through in the recording. This is sort of their hip, knee, leg bone here, some ribs, and it looks like these are the arm bones, so the head would have been in this area up here. Now this is pretty sparse evidence, and this is the case in a lot of hominin research, and some have argued that there's actually not enough information here. Bees also live in these caves and could have been the cause for pollen accumulation. But the fact that we see pieces of mammal bone, 2 flint blades, and charcoal nearby may be evidence of potential grave goods associated with this burial. The presence of those things as well strengthens the evidence, but it's still really tough to say, so jury is still kind of out on this one. The most recent discovery, though, comes from the 2018-2019 excavations, during which a set of bones associated with a skull that appears to have been flattened by the weight of the sediment above it. There's been no sex determination as of yet, and the condition of the teeth, though, suggests a middle or older aged adult. So this video that we're going to take a look at shows some really cool overhead views and 3D data collection that kind of allows for a video run through of the burial itself. So if you didn't catch it there in that last image, see if I can go back to it. There is the skull itself. Yeah, so that's what we're looking at here. You see some teeth kind of left over behind. It's kind of a skull in profile is what we're looking at in the video. So pretty neat discovery. The next site is KEBARA Cave in Israel, and its occupation dates as far back as 60,000 years ago, based on the remains of hearths, Middle Paleolithic tools, and also the large mammal bones that have been uncovered there. And it is also famous for the discovery of another set of hominin remains in 1982. And that has been still up to date, the most complete post-cranial Neanderthal skeleton that we have found. What we mean by post-cranial is everything from the neck down. This is the most intact burial of the sort that we have found. The individual themselves is excellently preserved. An adult male aged between 25-35 years old, lying on his back. His body is oriented east to west, and what we see preserved are the vertebral column, the ribs, and pelvis. The cranium and lower limbs, however, are missing. So this illustration, while it doesn't line up exactly with the photo underneath it, helps you gain a better sense of what we're actually seeing in the photo. You can see the mandible, the jawbone at the very top, shoulder blades, some of the arm bones, definitely the vertebral column, and then the hip bones. So it seems that this person died in the same position that they were covered in, but as we said, the skull is missing. One of the original excavators, Ofer Bar Yosef, suggested that the skull was actually removed by humans after the primary burial took place. The evidence for this is that we see carnivore chewed bones elsewhere, but this skeleton itself is free of tooth marks, so it would have had to have been covered up, or else animals scavenging around would have been able to get to it. The presence of the mandible, the hyoid, and the upper third molar suggest that the skull itself was very carefully removed post-decay. So you can imagine once the flesh is decaying, it's a little easier to take that top part of the skull off. No artifacts have been found in association with this burial. You'll see there's a few lithics on the left-hand side there, but the archaeologists seem to think that these are just part of the general fill and not necessarily in association with the burial itself. So overall, this is still pretty controversial topic. Some researchers argue that natural burial processes need to be ruled out, and then we can actually know for sure that these were intentional burials. This is a term we talk about called taphonomy, and that is the study of how organisms decay and become fossilized just naturally. So once we've ruled out the possibility of taphonomic processes, then we have hopefully have stronger evidence that this is a purposeful and intentional burial. There's still, like I said, pretty scattered evidence, and these are natural burials. If these are natural burials in caves or rock shelters, then they need to be further studied to, like I said, rule out these taphonomic processes. Okay, now your textbook and an additional reading that I'm going to ask you to do for this week, which is by Hayslip et al., called The American Funeral. That goes into a lot more details about, Western funerary practices, so I don't really feel the need to hash that out again here. But that is going to be the focus for this week's discussion. So I want you to read the article and consider these questions. Do you think that modern funerary practices reflect the regional, ethnic, and socioeconomic diversity of the United States? And for your knowledge as well, I want you to focus on what are the 3 competing explanations that the article discusses related to this topic in the first question. So hop online and have at it.